We often think the ocean floor is a quiet graveyard, but sometimes it screams. In 2025, the screens on the Norwegian vessel Helmer Hansen lit up with a ghostly image from 3,000 meters down. We do have a target in front of us, about 50 meters dead ahead. Looks interesting on sonar. It was the unmistakable silhouette of a missing Soviet predator, the B-37. Finding the wreck was a victory for history, but the celebration stopped cold when analysts looked closer at the data. There is a second anomaly down there, a massive cluster of unidentified objects lying next to the wreck. And get this, it looks like a secret stockpile that was never meant to be found, a new shape in the deep. The ship was equipped with the latest Kongsberg EM-710 multi-beam sonar systems. This isn't the kind of sonar you see in old war movies with a simple green blip on a round screen. This is technology capable of painting a three-dimensional picture of the abyss, slicing through the darkness with sound waves to reveal the texture of the mud and rock miles beneath the surface. The crew was scanning a sector near the Svalbard archipelago, a desolate collection of islands that serves as the gateway to the polar north. At a depth of nearly 3,200 meters, or about 10,500 feet, the sonar return changed. The flat, featureless monotony of the abyssal plain was broken by a large, rigid shape. As the technicians adjusted the frequency to 200 kilohertz to get a sharper resolution, the image sharpened on the monitors. It was not a rock formation. It was not a whale fall. It was manufactured. The shape was long, cylindrical, and undeniably the hull of a submarine. Based on the dimensions and the location, the identification came quickly. This was the resting place of the B-37, a Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine that had vanished from the face of the Earth more than 50 years prior, specifically in 1972, although some conflicting reports state 1970. Finding the sub was a massive historical achievement. It solved a mystery that had haunted naval historians for decades. But here's the catch. As the sonar operators widened their sweep to map the debris field, they noticed something that made no sense. About 500 meters, or roughly 1,600 feet away from the main wreckage of the sub, there was another return. It was a dense, clustered anomaly. It was not a part of the submarine's hull, like a broken sail or a detached stern. It was a separate mass entirely. The density readings suggested it was made of heavy metal distinct from the surrounding sediment. The atmosphere on the bridge of the Helmer Hansen shifted from excitement to confusion. In a typical shipwreck, the debris follows a pattern. You have the main hull, and then lighter pieces are scattered downstream by the current. But this object was heavy, compact, and sitting in a spot that defied the physics of a simple sinking. It looked like the submarine had been traveling with something, or perhaps it had met something down there in the dark. The sonar images were processed and reprocessed. The main hull of the B-37 looked terrible. The bow was crushed, likely from the impact with the bottom, and the midsection showed signs of a catastrophic implosion. That fits the standard narrative of a submarine loss. But the second anomaly? It looked like a collection of cylinders stacked or piled together. It looked organized. This discovery immediately triggered a wave of questions. The Soviet Navy was known for its secrecy, but they were also known for strict record-keeping. There were no records of a second vessel being lost in this area in 1972. There were no records of an underwater structure or a dumping ground at these specific coordinates. So, here's the deal. We have a submarine that was officially listed as having suffered a non-combat loss due to a battery fire. That is the official line Moscow gave to the world decades ago. A battery fire is a horrific way to go, but it is a self-contained disaster. It does not explain a massive field of unidentified heavy machinery sitting a quarter-mile away from the wreck. The Helmer Hansen could not send down a camera immediately. The currents in that sector were too strong for their light-duty, remotely operated vehicles, and the winter sea ice was beginning to creep south, threatening to lock the area down for the season. They had to rely on the acoustics, and the acoustics were telling a story that did not match the history books. The presence of this something else has ignited a firestorm of speculation among intelligence analysts and naval experts. If that second cluster is cargo, what was a diesel-electric attack submarine carrying that was so heavy and so large? Foxtrot submarines were hunters. They carried torpedoes and sailors. They were not cargo trucks. If the object is not cargo, could it be the wreckage of another vessel, a smaller submersible, or perhaps something the B-37 was towing? The timing of the discovery is also critical. In September 2025, the Arctic is no longer just a frozen wasteland. It is a strategic chessboard. Russia and NATO are vying for control of the northern trade routes. Finding a Soviet war grave is sensitive enough. Finding one that might contain unauthorized or unknown technology is a diplomatic nightmare. The sonar data has been shared with NATO command, and while the public release was sanitized, the whispers from those who have seen the raw files are disturbing. They suggest that the B-37 did not just suffer an accident. They suggest it was engaged in an operation that went fatally wrong, involving equipment that was never meant to exist. The ocean floor is a great preserver of history, keeping secrets frozen in time. But now the silence has been broken. The discovery of the B-37 is no longer just about closure for the families. It's about figuring out what lies in that shadow 500 meters away. The sonar pinged a warning that history is about to be rewritten. The last transmission. To understand why that second shape on the ocean floor is so baffling, we have to go back to the world the B-37 left behind. The year was 1972. The Cold War was in a strange phase. On the surface, there was talk of détente, a cooling of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. But underwater, the war was hotter than ever. The Soviet Navy was obsessed with one thing: the American aircraft carriers. They viewed these massive floating air bases as the ultimate threat to the motherland. To counter them, the Soviets built hundreds of submarines. The workhorse of this fleet was the Project 641, known to NATO as the Foxtrot class. The B-37 was one of these beasts. It was a diesel-electric submarine. This means it had to run noisy diesel engines on the surface or just below it using a snorkel to charge its massive banks of lead-acid batteries. Once charged, it could dive deep and run on electric power. When running on batteries, a Foxtrot was incredibly quiet. It was a black hole in the water. But it had a weakness. It could only stay submerged for a few days before it had to come up for air and power. Captain Second Rank Viktor Kovalenko was the man in charge of the B-37. He was an experienced commander, respected by his crew and trusted by the Northern Fleet Command. His orders were sealed, but we now know the objective. He was to take his boat and 78 men from the base at Polarny and head into the North Atlantic. His target was the USS Forrestal carrier battle group. The mission was simple but dangerous. He was to track the Americans, he was to record their acoustic signatures, learn their formations, and practice how he would attack them if the order ever came. It was a game of chicken played with thousands of tons of steel. The B-37 was packed with sensors and torpedoes. It was also packed with young men, conscripts, who were living in a steel tube that smelled of diesel, sweat, and cabbage. On April 10, 1972, the B-37 slipped out of its berth. The Barents Sea was clogged with ice floes, providing perfect cover for a submarine trying to break out into the open ocean without being detected by NATO listening posts. For the first 2 days, everything went according to plan. The sub checked in with headquarters using brief bursts of extremely low-frequency radio waves. These squawks were the heartbeat of the fleet. The last heartbeat came on April 12th. The sub reported its position near 71 degrees north, 12 degrees east. Captain Kovalino reported heavy ice conditions, but stated that all systems were nominal. He was hunting. He was closing in on the shipping lanes where the NATO exercise was taking place. And then, the silence set in. It is not that simple, though. Submarines are meant to be silent. A missed check-in is not immediately a cause for panic. Atmospheric conditions can block radio waves. Equipment can glitch. A captain might decide to stay deep to avoid detection. So for the first 24 hours, the Soviet command waited. They assumed Kovalenko was just being a good captain, staying quiet to stay safe. But by the second day, the silence became deafening. The Northern Fleet initiated Operation Sever, a massive search and rescue effort. They launched IL-38 May maritime patrol aircraft. They diverted other submarines to the area. They scoured 10,000 square kilometers of ocean. They listened for the distress pings of the emergency buoy. They listened for the sound of hull tapping. They heard nothing. The ocean is vast, and a submarine is small. Without a precise location, looking for a sunken sub is like looking for a needle in a haystack, only the haystack is pitch black and crushing you to death. The Soviet search teams found no oil slick. They found no debris floating on the surface. It was as if the B-37 had simply sailed off the edge of the world. This complete lack of surface debris is one of the reasons the new Sonar Discovery is so important. Usually when a sub suffers a catastrophic explosion on the surface or near it, things float. Life jackets, oil, insulation, something always bubbles up. The fact that nothing was found suggests the B-37 went down deep and went down fast. The crew of the B-37 were victims of the technology of their time. The Foxtrot class was rugged, but it was cramped and dangerous. The batteries were located in the bottom of the hull. If seawater leaked onto the batteries, it would create chlorine gas, choking the crew in minutes. If the batteries were overcharged, they produced hydrogen gas, which is explosive. A single spark could turn the sub into a bomb. For decades, the battery explosion theory was the most logical answer. It fit the profile. It explained the sudden loss of contact. But the new data from 2025 challenges this. A battery explosion blows the hull out, but it usually happens inside the pressure hole. It does not necessarily explain the something else found 500 meters away. The mission profile of the B-37 also contains a detail that was overlooked for years. Intelligence reports from the era mention that the sub was fitted with experimental signals intelligence gear. They were testing new ways to listen to American communications. This gear was heavy, power-hungry, and classified. Could the second anomaly be related to this equipment? Was the B-37 towing an external sensor array? Some Soviet subs were modified to tow long wire antennas or sonar sleds. If this sled snagged on a rock or malfunctioned, it could have acted like an anchor, dragging the sub down or causing it to stall in a dangerous maneuver. The silence of the B-37 was the first clue. It told the world that whatever happened, happened instantly. There was no time for a distress call, no time to blow the ballast tanks. 1 minute they were hunting the forestall, and the next they were falling toward the bottom. But the silence hid the truth for 50 years. Evidence of sabotage. Now we have to look closer at the mystery that has everyone baffled. The sonar scan from the Helmer Hansen is not just a picture. It is a density map, and the density of the object 500 meters away is telling us a story that contradicts the official records. Let's analyze the possibilities. The most boring answer is usually the right one, but in this case, the boring answers don't fit. Could it be a rock formation? Unlikely. The sonar resolution is high enough to distinguish between the jagged, random geometry of natural geology and the smooth, straight lines of artificial construction. This object has right angles and cylinders. Nature does not build in cylinders. So what is it? The first theory circulating among naval architects is that it is a sister component. When a submarine implodes, it breaks apart. The pressure hull collapses and the air inside is compressed until it triggers an explosion almost as powerful as dynamite. This can shear the bow or the stern off. It is possible that the stern of the B-37 broke away and drifted. However, the hydrodynamics don't support this. At that depth, heavy sections of a submarine sink like stones. They land relatively close to each other. A separation of 500 meters implies that the two objects were separated while they were still moving, or one was jettisoned with force. This brings us to the cargo theory. The Foxtrot class was a torpedo boat. It carried 22 torpedoes. These were massive weapons, 53 centimeters in diameter, weighing 2 tons each. If the sub suffered a fire in the torpedo room, is it possible the captain ordered the torpedoes jettisoned? Standard procedure would be to fire them or dump them to remove the explosive hazard, but a pile of torpedoes would scatter. They wouldn't sit in a neat cluster. The anomaly looks like a single large unit or several large units strapped together. This has led to a more controversial theory. The B-37 was carrying something on its deck. The Soviet Navy often used their submarines as mules. They would strap canisters to the outer hull to carry supplies to secret bases or to deliver commandos. These canisters were hydrodynamic, but they added drag and noise. If the B-37 was on a standard patrol, it shouldn't have had external canisters, but if it was on a resupply run to a secret listening post in the Arctic, it might have been overloaded. The sonar signatures bear a close resemblance to the containers used for the SSN-15 missiles, a weapon system that was being developed around that time.
These were anti-submarine missiles fired from torpedo tubes. But again, the timeline is tight. The B-37 was an older boat. Fitting it with next-generation missiles would have required a refit that isn't in the logs. Then there is the something else that no one wants to talk about openly, the possibility of a second vessel. The anomaly is roughly 150 feet long. That is too small for a full-size combat submarine, but it is the perfect size for a midget sub. The Soviets had a fleet of small spy subs like the Triton units. These were used for sabotage and infiltrating enemy harbors. Was the B-37 a mothership? Was it carrying a smaller spy sub on its back or towing one? If the B-37 got into trouble, perhaps a collision or a mechanical failure, the smaller vessel might have tried to detach. If the detachment failed or if they collided during the separation, it would explain why both ended up on the bottom, separated by a short distance. This theory aligns with the collision hypothesis. The Cold War under the ice was a contact sport. American and Soviet subs frequently bumped into each other. These hull-to-hull incidents were usually low speed, but fatal accidents happened. In 1974, a U.S. sub collided with a Soviet boat. In 1981, another collision occurred near Scotland. If the B-37 collided with a foreign object or even a friendly vessel during a transfer operation, it would explain the catastrophic damage to the bow seen in the sonar scans. Though something else could be the piece of the other vessel or the object they were transferring. The crazy part is the location. The debris field is situated in a way that suggests the submarine turned toward it before it died. It wasn't fleeing, it was maneuvering. This hints that the crew is fighting to save the ship, or perhaps fighting to save the cargo. There is also the matter of the cylinders seen in the scan. Some experts have pointed out they look dangerously like nuclear waste containers. The Soviets had a bad habit of dumping radioactive waste in the Kara and Barents Seas. It was a quick and dirty way to dispose of old reactor cores. Was the B-37 on a secret dumping mission, disguised as a patrol? If they were carrying unstable waste containers on the deck and one leaked or shifted, it could have poisoned the crew or caused the accident. The anomaly sits there 500 meters away, mocking the official story. It is a lunk of metal that represents a deviation from the truth. It proves that whatever the B-37 was doing, it was not just watching the weather. It was hauling something heavy, something secret, and something that ultimately dragged them down. The sonar has given us the what, but it hasn't given us the why. And the why is likely buried in the archives of the Kremlin, or perhaps inside that second cluster of debris. The evidence is mounting that this was not an accident. The KGB shadow. To understand the silence surrounding the B-37, you have to understand the mind of the Soviet leadership in the 1970s. Information was not something to be shared. It was a weapon. Admitting that a submarine had sunk was a sign of weakness. Admitting that you didn't know why it sank was even worse. When the search operation Sever failed to find the sub in 1972, the KGB clamped down on the narrative. The families of the 78 sailors were told very little. In some cases, they were told their sons were on a long-duration voyage. In others, they were told there had been an accident, but the details were classified state secrets. There were no funerals, there were no bodies. The secrecy wasn't just about pride, it was about strategy. The Soviets were terrified that the Americans would find the sub first. They had good reason to be paranoid. They knew about the Glomar Explorer. In 1974, the CIA launched Project Azorian. It was one of the most audacious intelligence operations in history. They built a massive ship ostensibly for mining manganese nodules, but its real purpose was to lift a sunken Soviet submarine, the K-129, from the floor of the Pacific Ocean. The Americans wanted the nuclear missiles and the codebooks inside. The Kremlin knew that if the Americans found the B-37, they would try to steal it too. The B-37 might not have been a nuclear-powered sub, but it carried codebooks, torpedoes, and that mysterious something else we discussed. If the Americans got their hands on that debris field, they would expose Soviet technology and potentially Soviet treaty violations. So the Soviets erased the B-37. They removed mentions of it from the active rosters, they classified the patrol logs, the sub became a ghost ship, existing only in the memories of the grieving families. It wasn't until the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s that the truth began to trickle out. In 1992, the